She had not cried like this since she was a child. Not the careful, managed tears she had learned to produce and contain in private, the ones she pressed into pillows and scarves and the inside of her own wrist, muffled and controlled and cleaned away before anyone could see the evidence. This was different. This was the crying that happens when the last wall comes down. When the body understands that there is finally no one left to hide from. When the accumulated weight of every suppressed feeling releases all at once into the open night air. Lena Voss lay on her side at the edge of the wilderness and wept until she slept. She did not notice the ground warming beneath her cheek. She did not notice the soil drinking. She did not notice the deep, slow, ancient stirring that began in the root memory of the earth below her, something waking from a very long sleep, responding to the specific signal it had been waiting centuries to receive. She only noticed, in the morning, when she opened her eyes. Trees. Ancient, towering, impossible trees, their trunks wider than 3 people linking hands. Their canopies so high above her that the morning light came through them in cathedral shafts. Their bark carrying the specific silver gray of growth measured in centuries. They surrounded her completely, a forest where last night there had been only dead open ground. She stood up slowly, reached out, pressed her palm flat against the nearest trunk. It was warm. Which country are you listening from? Please comment below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. There was a technique she had developed by the age of 12 that she privately called the arithmetic method. When she felt the tears coming, in a meeting in a corridor, in the middle of a formal presentation in the kingdom's natural history archive where she worked as a botanical recorder, she would begin counting backward from 200 by sevens. Not because the mathematics required concentration, exactly, but because it occupied the specific part of her mind that would otherwise be fully engaged in feeling the thing that was trying to make her cry, and the partial occupation was enough, usually, to hold the tide back until she could find a private space to release it safely. 200, 193, 186. She had used this method approximately 4,000 times in her adult life. She had a conservative estimate of this because she had, briefly, and with the dark humor of someone who has decided that if a thing is going to be her defining characteristic, she may as well document it precisely, kept count for 3 months in her 21st year. The average was 44 times per month. She had been managing this for 9 years. The management was necessary for a reason she had understood since she was 8 years old and had not needed to relearn since. Tears were her most visible flaw and her most dangerous secret simultaneously. And the combination of those 2 facts required a level of ongoing vigilance that had become so integrated into her daily functioning that she no longer experienced it as effort. It was simply the condition of being herself in a world that was not designed for what she was. Her work at the archive helped. Botanical recording was solitary, precise, and conducted largely in the company of press specimens and reference texts rather than people, which reduced the frequency of arithmetic method deployment considerably. She was good at the work, genuinely deeply good at it, in the way that people are good at things that are close to the center of who they are. She knew plants the way she knew them, from the inside out, through some quality of attention that her supervisor had once described as almost uncanny. A capacity to identify species from partial specimens and degraded samples that went beyond technical training into something more instinctive. She had been careful never to let anyone understand how close the instinct ran to the gift. The archive was her primary world. Outside it, she existed in the kingdom's Omega community with the specific, quiet invisibility of someone who has learned that invisibility is protective and has therefore cultivated it deliberately. She was not unfriendly. She was not cold. She simply occupied a careful minimum of social space, attending the required community gatherings, participating in the formal events on the calendar, managing her public presentation with the same methodical attention she brought to everything that required not being seen too clearly. The other Omegas had noticed her crying. Of course they had, years of management and 4,000 applications of the arithmetic method notwithstanding. She was not perfect. And the tears had escaped at inopportune moments often enough that she had acquired a reputation. Not malicious, the Omega community was, on the whole, too familiar with the structural indignities of their position to spend significant energy on internal cruelty. But present. She was the one who cried at the natural history presentations when a speaker described an extinct species. She was the one who had been seen once, weeping quietly in the corridor after a routine land assessment report noted the continued deterioration of the Southern Agricultural District. She was, in the gentle and permanent taxonomy of community observation, a person who felt things too strongly and could not always contain it. She had learned to receive this with the patient equanimity of someone who understands that the reputation is less dangerous than the alternative. The morning of the designation ceremony, she had woken before dawn and lain very still in her narrow bed in the Omega residential quarter and performed the arithmetic method preemptively. Because she had known, the way she knew things about growing things, through some deeper register than thought, that today was going to require everything she had. She had dressed carefully. She had arrived at the ceremony hall with her expression arranged in the specific composed neutrality she had been perfecting since childhood. She had stood in the line of presented omegas with her hands folded and her breathing measured and her mind running the arithmetic in the background, steady and automatic, a metronome of suppression keeping time beneath the ceremony's formal proceedings. Then the doors at the far end of the hall had opened and King Evander Ashmore had entered. And she had felt it, a recognition so clear and so complete that the arithmetic stopped mid-count, that every wall she had ever built went momentarily, helplessly silent, that the tears that rose were not grief or fear, but something she had no word for yet. She had looked at his face across the length of the ceremony hall, and she had known, with the specific certainty of things that are simply true, that he was hers. The knowledge sat in her chest like a seed in warm ground, waiting. She had been 14 years old, and it had been a Tuesday in early autumn, and the field had been dead for longer than she had been alive. The Southern Agricultural District's abandonment was not dramatic history. It was the slow, unglamorous kind of failure that happens when soil is overworked across generations until it gives up, when the nutrients are extracted faster than any natural process can replace them, when the land simply decides it has nothing left to offer and goes quiet in the specific, final way of exhausted things. The field at the edge of the district had been the last to fail. By the time Lena encountered it, it had been producing nothing for 11 years, pale, compacted earth that smelled of absence, where even the most persistent weeds had eventually conceded. She had gone there because of Petra. Petra had been her closest friend from age 9 to age 14, the only person in the Omega residential quarter who had never once mentioned the crying, who had in fact cried alongside her on several occasions with the uncomplicated solidarity of someone who considered shared feeling a form of companionship rather than weakness. When Petra had been exiled, for a separate reason, a political complication involving her family's status that Lena had not fully understood at 14, and understood better now, Lena had gone to the dead field because it was the furthest she could get from the residential quarter without leaving the district entirely, and she had needed to be somewhere that matched what she felt inside. She had sat on the pale, compacted earth and wept for Petra with the full, unmanaged grief of a 14-year-old who has just lost the only person who made the careful management of everything feel survivable. She had not been thinking about hiding. She had not been counting backward from 200. She had simply been devastated in the open, with no audience and no reason to be anything other than what she was. She had cried until she slept, as she would do again 11 years later on the night of her own exile. She had woken in the morning to roots. Not the full cathedral she would grow as an adult. Her gift was younger then, less developed, operating at a scale that reflected the specific proportions of a 14-year-old's emotional range, rather than a 25-year-old's accumulated losses. But significant, undeniable. 3 trees, already 30 feet tall, their trunks the diameter of a grown man's torso, their bark carrying the silver gray of genuine age that had no right to exist in something that had not been there the night before. A 4th tree, smaller but growing visibly, she had watched it for 10 minutes, rooted to the spot, certain she was imagining the movement, certain she was not. The terror had been immediate and total. She had understood, in the specific way that 14-year-olds understand things that will define the rest of their lives, that this was connected to her. To the crying, to the particular quality of what happened when her tears reached unprotected soil. She had tested this hypothesis with the methodical attention of someone who was already, at 14, A more careful observer than most adults, she knew, small controlled experiments. Private and careful, tears on stone producing nothing, tears on dry packed earth producing nothing. Tears on living soil producing modest and concealable growth, tears on dead soil producing the specific, explosive return of whatever that soil had been before it died. The pattern was clear within 2 months. She had told no one. The 3 large trees from that first morning had been impossible to conceal. She had tried, had pulled up what she could reach, had scraped at the edges, had spent 2 frantic hours attempting to reduce the evidence before the field's occasional visitors arrived. The largest trees had been too established already. She had retreated and watched, from a safe distance over the following weeks. As the Natural History Office sent investigators, as the botanical anomaly was catalogued, as the field's dead owner was contacted about the unexpected return of 3 mature specimens of a species that had not grown in this district for 2 centuries. The investigation had concluded, unexplained ecological event, possibly related to underground water table fluctuation. The trees had been designated a protected natural heritage site. They were still there. She knew because she had visited them carefully. In the years since, pressing her palms to their trunks and feeling the specific warmth that told her they were hers. That something of her grief for Petra lived in them. That the tears had not simply watered the earth, but had become it. She had spent the next 11 years becoming very, very good at the arithmetic method. In the present, on the second night after her exile, she sat in the middle of the impossible forest she had grown on her first night of freedom and turned her face up toward the canopy and thought about what it meant that she no longer had any reason to count. 200. 193. She stopped. She pressed both palms flat against the roots beneath her and felt the living network of everything she had grown respond, warm, patient, vast, waiting. She did not finish the count. The designation ceremony was held in the kingdom's formal presentation hall on the 1st of every month, which meant that the particular ceremony that had ended Lena's life in the kingdom had been one of 12 annual events, a routine occurrence in the institutional calendar, scheduled between a morning trade council briefing and an afternoon delegation from the Eastern Territories, allotted 90 minutes in the king's formal schedule. 90 minutes. She had thought about this number often in the days since. She had stood in the line of 11 presented omegas in the order of their designation ranking, a system based on bloodline assessment and social contribution metrics that she had always found quietly dehumanizing and had never said so, because saying so was not the kind of thing available to someone in her position. She was 7th in the line. This was unremarkable. Everything about her official presentation was unremarkable. By design, the careful neutral of her expression, the deliberate middle-of-the-line positioning of her posture, the complete absence of anything that might attract attention before she had assessed whether attention was safe. Then Evander had entered, and the bond recognition had arrived like a key turning. And every careful calibration she had spent 25 years building had gone simultaneously, helplessly irrelevant. She had not moved. She had not spoken. She had simply stood in the 7th position and felt the recognition with the full, overwhelming clarity of something that was not asking her permission. And she had looked at his face, and he had looked at hers, and in the space of that mutual looking she had understood what was happening and had felt, for approximately 4 seconds, something she had no prior experience of, the specific, groundless joy of being exactly where you were supposed to be. He had looked at her for 4 seconds. Then he had turned. Not dramatically, not with the announced cruelty of a formal rejection. Simply, a turn, a continuation. His gaze moving down the line, to the next presented omega with the smooth, practiced efficiency of a man completing an administrative obligation. His expression had not changed. His pace had not altered. The turn had been as unremarkable as everything else in the 90-minute event, which was, she had thought in the immediate silent aftermath, perhaps the most complete thing about it. The ceremony master had made a notation. She had seen him make it from the 7th position in the line, had watched his pen move with the brisk impersonality of someone recording an administrative outcome rather than a human event. The notation had taken 3 seconds. It had taken approximately the same amount of time as the bond recognition itself, which seemed, in the specific dark humor she was already developing about the experience, like a reasonable ratio. The escort had arrived before the ceremony concluded for the others. 2 palace officials, formal and not unkind, who had guided her from the presentation hall with the practiced efficiency of people performing a function they had performed before. She had gone without resistance. She had known what the notation meant. But the turn back had not been the original wound. The original wound was older. She had been 8 years old, and it had been a morning in late spring, and she had been sitting in the classroom of the Omega Residential Quarters educational facility when something, she could not remember now what specifically, some ordinary childhood grief, a lost possession or a social slight, or simply the accumulated small weight of being 8 years old in a world that did not particularly accommodate 8-year-olds, had made the tears come before the arithmetic method existed to stop them. She had cried in the classroom, not loudly, not dramatically, simply tears running down her face, in a room full of other children who had turned to look. The teacher, a beta woman named Instructor Kassel, whom Lena remembered with the specific, vivid accuracy that the mind reserves for people who cause formative damage, had looked at her from the front of the room and said, in the clear carrying voice of someone making a point for the benefit of the full class, excessive emotional display is a sign of weakness. It will not be tolerated in formal settings, and it will not serve you in your life. Control yourself. The class had looked. She had controlled herself. She had been controlling herself for 17 years. Now, on the road out of the kingdom, on her 3rd day of exile, she passed through the first dead village, low stone buildings, pale soil. The specific exhausted silence of a place that has been waiting too long for something to return. She stopped at its edge. She felt the deadness of the soil beneath her feet with the specific, deep recognition she had always felt in dead places and had never, until now, been in a position to do anything about. She looked at the pale ground. She looked at her own hands. Then she sat down in the center of the dead village's empty main road, and she did not count backward from anything. The first village was called Thresh. She learned this from a woman named Dara, who emerged from the nearest building on the morning after Lena's arrival to find ancient trees where her dead front yard had been, and who stood in the new dawn light with both hands pressed to her mouth, and her eyes doing the specific work of a person deciding whether what they are seeing is real. Dara was perhaps 60. With the particular economy of movement that comes from decades of managing a household on insufficient resources, and she looked at the trees with the expression of someone who has been waiting for something for so long that its arrival has temporarily exceeded the capacity of her emotional framework to receive it. Lena had been sitting at the grove's edge, eating the small breakfast she had assembled from her travel pack, watching the village begin to wake into its morning. She had wept the night before for the specific deadness of threshed soil, not strategically, not with the intention of producing trees, but simply because the deadness was genuinely sorrowful, and she was no longer obligated to do arithmetic about it. The trees had arrived in the night as they always arrived, quietly, completely, without any drama that she witnessed. She had simply woken inside them. Dara had looked at the trees and then looked at Lena, and the calculation on her face had been brief. You, she said, not accusatory, simply placing. I don't fully control it, Lena had said, which was the truest short answer she had. Dara had gone back inside her house and come out with 2 cups of something hot and sat down beside Lena in the roots of an ancient tree that had not existed yesterday. And they had drunk together in the morning quiet while the rest of the village emerged one by one to stand in the impossible forest and make the sounds that people make when something they had stopped believing in returns. Thresh had been dead for 22 years. Dara told her this while they drank. The soil failure, the failed harvests, the gradual exodus of families who could not sustain themselves on land that would not produce, the steadily diminishing population that now numbered 41, where it had once been 300. The trees that had grown overnight were species indigenous to this valley's original ecosystem. She knew them all, had recorded press specimens of their relations in the archive, could name their Latin designations and their soil relationships and their historical range. They would stabilize the ground. Their root systems would begin the centuries-long work of rebuilding the soil's nutrient architecture. In 50 years, the agricultural district surrounding Thresh would be viable again. She did not say this to Dara. She said, the land remembered what it was. I only reminded it. Dara had looked at her for a long moment with the specific, assessing attention of a woman who has survived a great deal and has learned to identify what is real. Then she had nodded, once, with the particular gravity of someone accepting a true thing. The second village was 2 days further along the road and had no name anymore. The sign at its entrance had fallen, and no one had replaced it, which told her everything she needed to know about the state of the community's relationship to its own continuity. She wept there for the namelessness as much as the deadness, and the grove that grew was denser than threshes, with an undergrowth so rich it had begun reclaiming the village's abandoned structures by morning, roots pushing gently through cracked foundations, moss appearing on stone walls with the speed of things that have been waiting for permission. The third village, Kala, had a population of 12. It had been 400. She sat in Kala's central square and wept for an hour before the tears ran out, not from performed grief but from the genuine, accumulating weight of 3 villages' worth of loss absorbed over a week of walking. And the grove that grew around Kala that night was the largest she had produced since the forest of her first exile night, trees whose canopies met overhead to form a complete vault, whose root systems extended 300 meters in every direction from the village's center, whose species composition included 2 that she had previously known only from historical botanical records as extinct in this region. Not extinct. Waiting. She was beginning to understand the difference. The people of Kala had found her in the morning with the same progression as thresh, disbelief, then wonder. Then the specific quality of cautious joy that people display when they have been hurt enough times. That joy now arrives with protective hesitation. She had stayed 2 days. She had helped where she could with practical things. There were plants she recognized in the new undergrowth whose medicinal properties she knew from the archive, and she gathered and prepared what was useful with the focused competence of someone applying real knowledge to real need. On the morning she left Kala, a child had pressed a small woven bracelet into her hand without explanation and run away. She was wearing it still. A week further along the road, the royal surveyor's horse prints crossed her path, heading in the same direction she was traveling. She noted them with the careful attention she brought to all new information and continued walking. 2 days after that, she arrived at a clearing so wide and so silent, and so specifically, deliberately empty that she stopped at its edge and felt the soil beneath her feet and understood, in the deep register of her gift, that this was not ordinary dead land. This was mourned land. This was land that knew it had lost something and had been grieving its own loss for 5 generations. She sat down at the clearing's center. She did not plan what came next. She simply felt what the land felt and let it be the same as what she felt. And the tears came with the specific, clean honesty of genuine recognition. She did not know yet whose grove she was about to grow. The first report had come from the Southern Survey Office on a Wednesday. Evander read it at his desk in the manner he read all reports, efficiently, with the practiced skim of someone who had learned to extract the relevant information from administrative language without becoming mired in its texture. Anomalous forest growth, Southern Agricultural District. Location cross-referenced with 3 previous dead zone designations. Species composition inconsistent with current regional ecology. Estimated age of specimens, 100 to 300 years. Estimated time of growth, overnight. He had read it twice. Then he had passed it to his chief natural historian with a note requesting assessment, and had moved to the next item in the correspondence stack, because that was the correct administrative response to an unexplained botanical event, and he was, above all things, a man who produced correct administrative responses. The second report had come 4 days later. Different location, same characteristics. Overnight growth, ancient species, dead zone restored. The third report had arrived before he finished reading the second. He had stopped passing them to the Natural History Office after the 5th. He had begun reading them himself in sequence, spreading the survey maps across his desk in the evening after the day's formal business was concluded and tracing the locations with his finger in the specific, private manner of a man who does not want to be observed doing the thing he is doing. The locations formed a line. Not a perfect line, it curved slightly. Followed the natural geography of the road that ran through the kingdom's most damaged agricultural districts. The road that connected the communities that had been failing for 2 decades and that his administration had been managing with the careful inadequacy of people applying economic instruments to problems that were not economic in origin. The road that led away from the capital. The road that exile escorts used. He had known this by the fourth report. He had not said it aloud to anyone, because saying it aloud would have required him to follow the acknowledgement to its next location. And the next location was a place he had been not going since the morning after the designation ceremony, when he had woken with the specific, physical discomfort of someone who has made a decision and is beginning to understand its full weight. He had made the correct decision. He had told himself this with the practiced efficiency of a man who has learned to apply administrative logic to personal matters. The bond had been felt. He did not deny the bond, had never denied it in the privacy of his own assessment, but the bond was a biological fact, not a political directive. He was a king. His bonding choice carried the weight of alliance, of succession strategy, of the complex diplomatic architecture of a realm that required its monarch to make decisions in the service of the kingdom rather than the service of his own biology. He had made the correct decision. The forest reports had begun arriving 9 days after the ceremony. He had been a man who produced correct administrative responses, and he had stood in his study on the evening of the 7th report and looked at the map with the 7 locations marked on it and understood, with the specific, unwilling clarity of someone whose rational framework has been insufficient to the task assigned to it, that the correct administrative response was no longer available to him. Something was happening to his kingdom. Something was waking in the land behind a path that he had created by a turn of his body in a ceremony hall. And whatever it was moving with a purposefulness that felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a response, the land answering something, being asked something, being given something that it had been waiting for. He rode out on the 8th day. His retinue had assembled with the practiced efficiency of a royal travel party, advisors, guards, documentation staff, and he had reduced it by 2/3 before departure because the full complement felt wrong for reasons he did not examine closely. He rode with 6 guards and Torin, his most trusted aide, and he followed the map's line south into the agricultural districts with the focused urgency of someone who has been sitting with a feeling long enough that the only remaining option is to go toward it. The second anomalous forest was his first direct encounter with what Lena had grown. He dismounted at its edge and stood for a long time before entering. The trees were exactly as the reports had described, ancient, towering, species that should not exist here in this density or at this age, but the reports had not conveyed the quality of the place, which was the thing that stopped him at the boundary and required him to stand still and simply receive it. It felt inhabited, not by people, by time, by the specific, accumulated presence of centuries of growth compressed into a single night. The way a very old person sometimes seems to carry a different quality of air around them than the people who have lived less. He walked to the grove's center, stood with his hands at his sides and his chest doing something he was not going to describe to Torin. Then he walked back to the grove's edge, and in the last of the afternoon light, caught on a branch at approximately shoulder height, was a piece of fabric, small, torn from something larger. The specific deep blue-gray of the exile escort's standard-issue traveling cloak. He took it down, held it for a moment. He knew the color. He had seen it 9 days ago in the ceremony hall, when the escort had arrived for the 7th Omega in the presentation line. And he had not watched them go because watching them go had not been something the correct administrative response required of him. He put the fabric in his coat pocket. He looked at the map, at the line of marked locations, at the direction the line was traveling. He knew where it was going. He had known since the 3rd report, when the trajectory had become clear, and had not followed the knowledge because following it meant following what it implied. And what it implied was that the land was doing something in response to what he had done, and that the response was magnificent, and that the magnificence had a cost he had not yet been willing to fully calculate. He mounted his horse. He rode through the night. She had not planned to stop here. The clearing had simply been where the light went first, a wide, open space where the road curved slightly east, and the surrounding landscape opened into something that was neither field nor forest, nor the specific dead zone geography she had been moving through for 2 weeks. It was its own category of land, and she had felt the difference beneath her feet from the moment she stepped into it. The way you feel a change in temperature when you move from a shaded space into direct sun, immediate, physical, requiring no interpretation. She had stopped because the land asked her to. This was not a mystical event. It was the practical reality of her gift's operation. The soil beneath her had a specific quality of receptiveness that she had learned to recognize over 2 weeks of daily intimacy with the kingdom's damaged landscapes. And this clearing's receptiveness was of a different order than anything she had encountered before.
Welcome back to our channel. Today Mott V brought you a brand new and incredibly captivating story, sure to please you if we watch the whole video. This story is entirely fictional. The video was created using artificial intelligence AI and is designed to provide positive entertainment and educational value to viewers aged Muiba and up. Now let us continue exploring today's story.
It was not the passive waiting of Thresh's exhausted ground, or the dull grief of Kala's long-abandoned fields. This was active. This was a place that had been holding something, tension or intention or the specific, sustained readiness of a container that has been waiting for its contents to return, for a very long time. She had unslung her travel pack and sat down in the clearing's center and placed both palms flat on the ground. The soil's communication was immediate and unmistakable, even through the medium of her gift, which she was still learning to interpret with the full precision it deserved. The quality of this place was distinct, deeply damaged in the specific way of intentional destruction rather than neglect, carrying in its root memory the chemical traces of fire, 5 generations old fire. The kind of burning that leaves traces in soil chemistry for centuries because the destruction was thorough and deliberate and complete. But beneath the fire memory, preserved in the deepest layer of the soil's biological archive, was something else. An enormous seed memory, patient and dense. The stored potential of a forest so established in this ground's fundamental nature that 5 generations of ash had not been sufficient to erase it. The clearing had been a forest. A significant forest. The kind of forest that takes centuries to establish and that, once established, becomes so integrated into the soil's living architecture that the soil itself carries the forest's blueprint in its deepest chemistry, waiting for the conditions that would allow the blueprint to be expressed. She had not known any of this consciously. She had simply felt the land's quality and responded to it with the honest, unmanaged emotion it produced in her, a profound, aching sadness for something lost that had been loved, for the specific grief of intentional destruction, for whatever community had once stood in the presence of these trees and had been deprived of them by someone else's decision. She had wept, genuinely, deeply, with the full emotional engagement that her gift required and that she was, after 2 weeks of practice, becoming more fluent in. She had wept for the burned forest and the people who had mourned it and the 5 generations of absence and the specific quality of a landscape that knows it has been deliberately unmade. She had slept with her palms still flat on the ground. In the morning, she could not see the sky. The canopy above her was so dense, so complete, so fully realized that the morning light arrived as a diffuse, warm luminescence rather than direct sun, the specific quality of light inside a very old, very established forest where the canopy has grown together over centuries into a living ceiling. She sat up slowly, looked at the trunks surrounding her, enormous, silver-gray, deeply furrowed with the specific bark texture of species whose age was measured in centuries rather than decades. The undergrowth was so rich she had to look carefully to find clear ground to stand on, ferns and mosses and low-flowering plants she recognized from historical botanical records as species indigenous to this region's pre-development ecosystem. But the grove was different from the others in a quality she could not immediately name. She spent an hour moving through it, pressing her hands to trunks, crouching to examine the undergrowth, tracing root patterns with the focused attention of someone for whom a forest is the most legible thing in the world. The difference was in the arrangement. The other groves she had grown had been beautiful and ecologically precise, but essentially spontaneous, the land expressing its own remembered ideal, which was wild and various and true. This grove had a structure. The central clearing she had slept in was circular, with a precision that was not artificial but felt intentional in the way that some natural things feel intentional, as if the forest itself had grown toward a specific geometry, a specific center, a specific relationship between the trees that felt like a space designed to hold something important. a space designed for gathering, for ceremony, for the specific human use of being together in the presence of something ancient and larger than any individual. She was crouching at the central clearing's edge, examining the root system of the largest tree she had ever grown, when her hand touched something that was not root. She cleared the new growth carefully. The ferns and mosses had already begun covering it, the speed of the grove's growth having buried it slightly in organic material, and found a stone, carved. The carving was deep and clear despite its evident age, the kind of inscription made with the intention of permanence, in the specific formal style of official royal stonework. The crest was unmistakable. She had worked in the kingdom's natural history archive for 3 years, and had handled enough royal documentation to recognize the design immediately, the specific arrangement of its heraldic elements, the precise formal style of a particular historical period. This was royal land. This was royal sacred land. She sat back on her heels and looked at the crest and felt, in the specific interior register of her gift, the enormous, patient satisfaction of a forest that had finally returned to itself after 5 generations of waiting. Behind her, at the clearing's distant edge, she heard a horse. She did not run. This was a decision made in the 4 seconds between hearing the horse and understanding who the horse carried, a decision that surprised her slightly, because running had been her available response to most things for most of her life, and the fact that it did not present itself as the correct option now told her something about who she had been becoming in the 2 weeks since the exile. She stood instead, turned to face the clearing's edge where the trees parted along the natural corridor the forest had left. Not a road, not a path exactly, but the specific opening that forests sometimes create, as if in acknowledgement of the direction from which something important will arrive. She stood in the clearing's center with the carved stone marker behind her and her hands at her sides, and the grove surrounding her in its full, impossible, ancient presence. And she watched Evander Ashmore ride into the forest. She had grown from her tears over the thing his line had lost. He rode alone. She had expected guards, retinue, the full apparatus of royal arrival. He came with none of it, just himself on a dark horse, in a traveling coat that bore no insignia, with the expression of a man who has been riding through the night and has arrived at a place he was not certain he would find, and is now standing in the reality of it with all of his preparation proving insufficient to the actual experience. He stopped at the clearing's edge, looked at the grove, really looked with the specific, full attention of someone receiving something rather than assessing it. She watched him take it in, the canopy, the trunks, the arrangement of the trees, the central clearing and its sacred geometry that the forest had grown toward. She watched his face do something she had not expected and had not prepared for, which was the reason she had stopped preparing her face for things in the past 2 weeks. He looked like a man standing in a place he had believed was permanently gone. Not the face of a king assessing a territorial anomaly. The face of a person encountering something they had been given to understand was lost, that had belonged to something larger than themselves, that carried the weight of every generation between them and the loss. She had documented enough extinct species in the archive to recognize the specific quality of grief that transforms when the lost thing returns. Not simply joy, but the complicated, almost unbearable intersection of joy and the full understanding of the loss that preceded it. He saw her. The recognition was immediate. She had not changed enough in 2 weeks for the 7th in-line Omega from the designation ceremony to be unrecognizable. And his face confirmed that he had known who he was riding toward before he arrived. He had known since the fabric on the branch, perhaps since the first report. The recognition settled into his expression as something he was not attempting to manage, which was itself a form of information she filed carefully. He dismounted, led the horse to the clearing's edge, and looped its reins over a low branch with the unhurried movement of someone who has made a decision about pace and is committed to it. Then he walked into the clearing. He stopped 10 feet from her. The distance was deliberate, close enough for conversation, far enough to be unambiguously respectful. The distance of someone who understood that they had no right to less space than she chose to give. He looked at her. She looked at him. The grove breathed around them in the specific, a live way of very old forests, the slow creak of enormous trunks, the soft movement of the canopy far overhead. the particular quality of air that ancient trees produce, dense with the chemical signatures of centuries of growth. He said her name, not her designation number from the ceremony roster, not her official title from the archive's staff records. Her name, Lena, in the quiet, careful voice of someone using it as the specific instrument it was. The acknowledgement that she was a person with a name rather than a function with a designation. She had not heard her name spoken by another person in 15 days. The impact of this was something she had not anticipated and did not have time to prepare for, a sudden physical response in her chest, the specific, complicated ache of hearing yourself named after an extended period of namelessness. She did not cry. She was not going to cry in front of him in the first 30 seconds of their first encounter. Not because she was ashamed of crying, but because the tears that were threatening to arrive were not yet the right tears for this moment, and she trusted her gift enough now to know the difference. She breathed, steadied. "You know who grew this forest," she said. Not a question. Yes. He looked at the trees around them, at the specific, impossible maturity of them, at the sacred geometry of the clearing's arrangement, at the carved stone half visible in the new growth at her feet. When he looked back at her, the rawness in his expression had not been managed away. "I know what you grew it from." The grove was very still around them. "I did not know whose land this was," she said. "I did not know the history. I only knew the land was grieving something." He received this without flinching. His jaw tightened slightly, the specific, contained compression she would come to know as his version of being moved. "It was our ancestral grove," he said quietly, "burned 5 generations ago by an enemy who understood what they were taking. We have not been able to restore it." A pause, weighted with something that was not performance. "We did not know how." The silence between them was full of the living forest and everything it represented and everything it had cost. He did not leave when she asked him to. He left the clearing. He respected that boundary, withdrawing to the grove's outer edge with the specific, unhurried compliance of a man who understood that the space she was asking for was not negotiable and who did not make her ask twice. But he did not leave the forest. She had heard his horse settle at the tree line, had heard the particular quality of outdoor stillness that contains a human presence rather than simply open space, and had understood that he was sitting with his back against one of the ancient trees she had grown. In the dark, at the edge of the grove she had made from her tears over his family's loss. She had not gone after him to tell him to go further. She had sat in the central clearing with her palms on the roots and let him stay, which was itself a decision she noted without fully examining. He was examining other things. Evander sat against the base of a tree whose trunk required for people to encircle and whose bark was the specific, deeply furrowed silver gray of something that had been growing for at least 2 centuries. And he thought about the ceremony with the specific, unwilling focus of a man who has been successfully avoiding a thought for 15 days and has finally run out of the distance required to keep avoiding it. He had made the correct decision. He had told himself this often enough that the telling had developed its own practiced rhythm, the internal equivalent of a well-worn path, familiar, automatic, requiring no new navigation. The bond was biological. His bonding choice was political. The 2 categories did not need to align. Other kings had managed this. Other kings had felt the bond's recognition and had turned from it toward more strategically significant partnerships and had built functional, successful alliances. Other kings had not sent their bonded omega into exile by the mechanism of their own indifference, and then had the land record the exile in living wood. This was the thought he had been running from. This was what was waiting at the end of the correct administrative response's logic, when you followed it all the way to its human endpoint. She had been in the designation ceremony because that was where the kingdom put omegas who had not been claimed, and he had not claimed her. And the cascade consequence of his non-claim had been a notation and an escort and a road out of the kingdom that she had walked alone. He had not ordered the exile. He had told himself this. He told himself this again, against the bark of the enormous tree. In the dark of the forest, she had grown from her grief over the grove he had lost. And the telling felt, for the first time, like what it was, an accurate fact being used to carry more moral weight than an accurate fact could bear. He had not ordered the exile. He had created the conditions for it with complete knowledge of what those conditions produced. The distinction was real. The distinction was also, he understood sitting in this grove, insufficient. He thought about the reports, the dead villages, Thresh, the nameless village, Kala. He had read all of the survey descriptions, had traced all of the paths on the map, had understood in the abstract that the forests represented something significant. Sitting inside one of them, feeling the quality of air that only existed inside very old trees, he understood that the abstract had been insufficient. Each forest represented a night of her sleeping on dead ground and giving it something it needed. Each forest was a record of something she had genuinely felt. And she had been feeling it alone, in exile, on the road his ceremony had sent her down. He reached into his coat pocket, removed the piece of fabric he had taken from the branch at the second forest's entrance, the deep blue-gray of the exile escort's standard-issue traveling cloak, a color he had watched leave the ceremony hall 15 days ago, without watching it go. He held it in his hands in the dark. Then he stood and walked back into the clearing, because the alternative was sitting at the tree line pretending he was giving her space when what he was actually doing was sitting with his own reckoning and calling it courtesy. She was still at the clearing's center, her palms on the roots, her eyes closed. She opened them when she heard his approach and looked at him with the level, unhurried attention he was beginning to understand was simply her baseline, not a performance of composure, but the genuine article. The specific stillness of someone who has been managing difficult things long enough to have developed a real relationship with their own steadiness. He crouched down to the root level, which put them at approximately the same height, which he suspected she noticed. He set the piece of fabric on the root between them. She looked at it, looked at him. "I found it at the second forest," he said. "At the entrance, caught on a branch." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You have been following the trail." "Since the fourth report." "How many forests?" 7 before this one. He looked at the clearing around them, the sacred geometry, the ancient trunks, the canopy overhead. "This is the 8th. She nodded slowly. He watched her receive the number, not the count of forests he understood, but the count of nights. 8 nights of genuine feeling offered to dead ground. 8 records of what it had cost her to walk through a kingdom that did not know she was walking through it. "The grove," he said. "What did it feel like? The land here?" She considered the question with the focused attention she brought to precise things. "Like grief that had been held very carefully for a very long time," she said. "Like something that had been waiting to be witnessed." He sat with this for a long time in the ancient, impossible dark. He came back in the morning with food. Not palace provisions, not the formal presentation of a king extending hospitality to a subject. He had left his travel pack at the tree line and returned to the clearing with the practical, unpretentious offering of someone who had realized that neither of them had eaten since the previous afternoon and had addressed this reality without ceremony. Bread, dried fruit, 2 portions of something wrapped in cloth that turned out to be a dense, serviceable travel cake of the kind that the Royal Guard's provisioning staff prepared for extended field operations. She had looked at the food and then at him, and had accepted the portion he extended with the brief, honest gratitude of someone who was hungry and was not going to perform indifference about it. They had eaten at the clearing's center, sitting on the roots of the largest tree, in the specific, comfortable silence of people who have already said significant things to each other and do not feel required to fill the morning with smaller ones. He had told her about the grove during the eating, not as a formal historical briefing, but in the way that people tell the stories of things they have lost when they are sitting in the presence of those things returned. His great-great-great-grandmother had planted the grove's founding trees. It had been a sacred space for 5 generations, the place where the royal family performed the ceremonies that were too personal for the formal ceremony halls, the births and deaths and bondings and grief rites that required something older and more honest than stone architecture. The burning had been an act of deliberate cultural destruction, the enemy having understood what they were taking as thoroughly as the family had understood what they were losing. 5 generations of kings had tried to restore it. 5 generations of botanical experts, soil engineers, imported saplings from related species. Nothing had taken. The soil had been too damaged, the root memory too disrupted, the original ecosystem too specifically complex to be rebuilt through external intervention. She had listened with the complete, patient attention she brought to significant things. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "The soil remembered everything. It was not damaged beyond recovery. It was waiting for the right signal." "What is the right signal?" She looked at her hands. "Something genuine. The land knows the difference between being worked and being felt. Your botanical experts were working it. I felt it." She paused. "I did not know whose grove it was. I felt what the land felt, and I let myself feel it too. That is, all the signal is someone being honest about grief in a place that has been grieving." He was quiet for a moment, receiving this. Then, "Can you teach it?" The question was simple, and the implications were not. And she could see him understand this as he asked it, his expression moving through the asking with the honest awareness of someone who knows they may be requesting something that is not available for the reasons they hope. "The genuine part cannot be taught," she said carefully. "What can be taught is the permission. Most people who feel things about land, about loss, about damage, about the grief of watching living places die, do not permit themselves to feel those things fully, because they have been told that feeling them fully is not useful, that it is indulgent, that it does not solve anything." She looked at the trees around them. "It solves everything. The land needs to be grieved as much as it needs to be worked. The grief is part of the work. But I spent 25 years learning that feeling too much was a flaw, and that learning does not come undone in a morning." He held this. She watched him hold it, not deflecting it toward a solution, not summarizing it into something more administratively manageable, holding it with the genuine attention of someone who is choosing to receive what is being given, rather than immediately convert it into something they can act on. After a long moment, he reached into his coat and removed the piece of fabric, the exile cloak's deep blue-gray, and set it on the root between them again. "I did not read the ceremony master's notation before the ceremony concluded," he said. "I did not watch the escort leave. I made a decision I believed was correct, and I did not follow it to its human endpoint. And by the time I understood the endpoint, you were already on the road." She looked at the fabric, looked at him. "I know. I am telling you because I need you to know that I know, not because knowing it changes what happened." "No," she agreed. "It does not change what happened." The grove was quiet around them. The morning light came through the canopy in the diffuse, warm luminescence of a very old and very established forest. And in that light she could see the full quality of his expression, open, unguarded. The specific face of a man who has decided that being seen clearly is more important to him right now than being seen favorably. She picked up the piece of fabric, folded it once, and placed it in her own coat pocket. He watched her do this with the specific attention of someone filing a very important piece of information. She stood, moved toward the grove's edge where her botanical specimen bag was waiting. "I am going to gather this morning," she said. "There are species in the undergrowth I have only seen in historical records. If you want to understand what the grove is, come and let me show you." He stood without hesitation. "I want to understand what the grove is," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "Then keep up." The meeting took place in Lord Aldrich's private study on a Friday evening. After the formal council session had concluded, and the administrative day had emptied the palace's official corridors of the witnesses that official business required. Aldrich had chosen the guest list with the precision he applied to all significant investments, which was what this was. In the taxonomy he used to organize most things that mattered. Lord Marsh, whose imported timber monopoly represented the kingdom's single largest privately held commercial interest, and who had been building that interest across 12 years of barren landscape economics with the patient, methodical attention of someone who understood that other people's disasters were opportunities if you arrived early and stayed organized. Councillor Vale, whose official role in land valuation assessment had given him both the access and the influence to ensure that the economic architecture of dead zone acquisition had proceeded with institutional endorsement rather than despite it. And a fourth man, a natural historian named Dorset, credentialed and respected, whose assessments had shaped the official scientific record of the dead zone designations, and whose cooperation would be essential to the strategy Aldrich was constructing. They had gathered with the informal ease of people who had been in rooms like this together before and understood the unspoken protocols of such gatherings. What could be said directly? What required circumlocution? What needed to remain entirely in the register of implication? Aldrich had opened with the economic analysis, because the economic analysis was the cleanest part and therefore the most persuasive starting point. 14 of the Southern District's dead zone parcels, land acquired at crisis prices over the past decade, legitimately within the existing legal framework, which Aldrich was careful to note because the legitimacy was both real and important, had experienced or were adjacent to the anomalous growth events. The return of viable ancient forest to those parcels was not, in itself, a legal problem. But the implications of viability restoration were significant. Land classified as agriculturally dead carried specific valuation assessments that affected its taxation category, its inheritance treatment, its permitted use designations, and the specific provisions of the ownership agreements under which several of the parcels had been transferred. Living ancient forest, inhabited and ecologically functional, was classified differently. The reclassification process, if triggered, would require a full assessment of the affected parcels under the kingdom's land rights framework. The assessment would surface the acquisition agreements. The acquisition agreements, examined in the context of viable land rather than dead land, would raise questions. Marsh had said, with the careful flatness of a man identifying a threat without performing alarm about it, "The timber market is the simpler problem. If the kingdom has indigenous ancient forest producing at the volume these growth reports suggest, the import dependency I have built my operation on ceases to exist within a generation." Dorset had asked the question that was doing the most work in the room. "Has the source been identified?" Aldrich had looked at him steadily. The survey reports all place a single individual at the center of each growth event. A woman traveling on foot, on the Exile Road south. The timing is consistent with a departure from the capital approximately 2 weeks ago. A pause. The king has been following the trail personally for the past week. He arrived at the ancestral grove location 2 days ago. The room had received this with the particular quality of silence that follows information that changes the shape of a situation. Vale, who had been quiet until this point with the specific, calculating patience of a man who preferred to speak when he had completed his assessment, said, "If the king is personally invested in the source, the conventional approaches are unavailable." "Not unavailable," Aldrich said. "Redirected." He had prepared for this part of the conversation with the same methodical care he brought to all significant investments. The woman has no current legal standing. She was processed through the designation ceremony as an bonded surplus and is classified as an unregistered exile. She has no right of petition, no right of formal address to the council, no recognized status under the kingdom's existing framework. He let this settle. The activity she is conducting, producing anomalous biological growth of unknown mechanism in the kingdom's territory, affecting land classifications, disrupting established economic assessments, can be formally characterized as an uncontrolled natural phenomenon of unverified origin and unknown risk profile. Dorset, understanding where this was going and not visibly objecting to the destination, a hazard classification, a precautionary assessment order, issued by the Natural History Council's Safety Committee, which does not require royal endorsement for precautionary measures. Under the precautionary assessment framework, she can be detained for evaluation without the standard petition process. Aldrich's voice was measured, reasonable, the voice of a man presenting a logical sequence. The evaluation process takes time. Time is what we need. The room had absorbed this with the collective, unhurried calm of people who had made calculations of this type before and understood their mechanics. Marsh had asked the final question, the one that lived underneath all the others. "And if the king objects?" Aldrich had looked at the window. The king has been at the Grove location for 2 days without sending official communication to the council. He left without a full retinue, without advisory staff, without documentation personnel. He is operating, for the moment, outside his official capacity. The council has both the authority and the obligation to act on safety matters in the interim. A pause. By the time official objection is formally registered, the assessment order will already be in process. The meeting had concluded 20 minutes later. In the Grove, 3 days' travel south, Lena was pressing her palms to an ancient trunk in the morning light, learning the forest's mycorrhizal language, while Evander crouched beside her and listened to her explain what her hands were telling her. She felt nothing different in the soil beneath her feet. Not yet. But 2 days later, walking back toward the capital at Evander's side, a royal courier intercepted them on the road with a sealed document bearing the Natural History Council's official crest. She read her own description in its formal language, unidentified biological phenomenon. Precautionary assessment order, immediate detention for evaluation pending safety determination. She read the document twice. Not because it was unclear. The language was precise and the mechanism was transparent, and she had spent enough time in the archive handling official documentation to parse the specific procedural instrument being deployed within the first reading. She read it twice because the first reading was for comprehension and the second reading was for the particular private ritual she had developed for receiving difficult official communications. She allowed herself to feel the full impact of what she was holding before she decided what to do about it. The full impact was this: they had found the most elegant available instrument. She had no legal standing. She had no right of petition, no right of formal address, no recognized status under the kingdom's framework. The precautionary assessment order did not require a crime. It did not require evidence of harm. It required only the formal classification of her activity as an uncontrolled phenomenon of unknown risk profile, which was a classification that her gift, described in sufficiently clinical language by sufficiently credentialed natural historians, could be made to fit without obvious distortion. They had done this correctly. She acknowledged this with the specific, unsentimental clarity of someone who has learned to assess threats accurately, because inaccurate assessment is more dangerous than uncomfortable truth. Evander had read his copy. The courier had brought two, which was itself a message about the council's understanding of the situation, and the expression on his face was the compressed, directed version of something larger. The specific stillness of a man containing a significant reaction while he decided what to do with it. She waited for the containing to complete. "I can override this," he said. The sentence was flat, controlled, carrying the weight of certainty beneath its surface. A direct royal instruction to the Natural History Council suspending the precautionary assessment. Order. "I have the authority. I can issue it today." She looked at him. "I know you can," she said. "Then. And if you do, Aldrich files a formal challenge to the royal instruction through the council's oversight mechanism, which buys him 3 weeks of procedural delay, during which Marsh's legal team files a separate challenge to the land reclassification implications of the Grove restorations, which triggers an independent assessment of the economic impact, which surfaces the acquisition agreements under the dead zone valuation framework. She folded the document precisely along its existing creases. And in the middle of all of that procedural movement, I am still an unregistered exile with no legal standing. And everything you do on my behalf is vulnerable to the challenge that you are acting from personal interest rather than legal authority." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through the sequence, not because the sequence was difficult, but because the sequence led somewhere he had not yet arrived at, and he was following it honestly rather than stopping at the point where it became uncomfortable. "They built this around your standing," he said finally. "The absence of it." "Yes." "Then the standing needs to be restored before anything else." "Yes. Formally. Publicly. With full legal documentation entered into the official registry, acknowledging that the designation ceremony's cascade classification was applied incorrectly to someone whose status should have triggered a different outcome." She looked at him with the level, direct attention she brought to all significant things. Not quietly, not administratively, publicly, with the specific acknowledgement that the ceremony's outcome was the result of a non-acknowledgement, and that the non-acknowledgement was an error. The road was very still around them. The courier's horse was cropping grass at the verge with the philosophical detachment of animals who do not concern themselves with the implications of the documents they carry. The afternoon light was the long, golden kind of late autumn that made everything look more resolved than it was. She watched him understand what she was asking. Not just the legal mechanism, the public accountability, the formal, documented, irreversible acknowledgement that what had happened at the ceremony was not a procedural cascade, but a human choice with a human consequence, and that the consequence had walked through the kingdom's most damaged landscapes and wept them into forests. and that the record should reflect this in terms that did not minimize either the cause or the cost. He was not performing the weight of this. He was carrying it visibly, in the specific way of a man who has been building toward a reckoning and has finally arrived at it with enough honesty to let the reckoning be the full size it actually is. If I do this publicly, he said, Aldrich will argue I am compromised, that the restoration is personally motivated and therefore should not be legally binding. He will argue this regardless of how you do it, she said. The difference is that a public restoration, fully documented, is harder to procedurally challenge than a quiet administrative correction. The documentation becomes its own protection. She paused. And I would rather have my standing restored in a way that is honest about why it was removed then. In a way that treats the removal as a clerical error. He looked at her for a long moment. The grove was 3 days behind them. The forests she had grown stretched across the southern districts in a trail that the whole kingdom was beginning to talk about. And she was standing on a road with a precautionary assessment order in her hands, telling him that the correct response to it was not the fastest one. He reached out and took the document from her hands, folded it once more, and put it in his coat pocket, beside the place where the exile cloak fabric had been. I will not run from this either, he said quietly. I want you to know that. She studied him for a long moment, the ink-stained hand, the traveling coat, the open expression that had been accumulating her trust since the grove's center. They will try to make the council hearing about the hazard classification, she said. About the economic disruption, about the unknown mechanism and the uncontrolled phenomenon. His jaw set with the specific, quiet resolution she was beginning to recognize as him at his most decided. Let them try. She almost smiled. Those are my words. They were good words. She arrived at the capital 3 days before the hearing. Evander had arranged accommodation in a building adjacent to the civic quarters official proceedings complex, not the palace, which she had not agreed to, not the Omega residential quarter, which she would not return to, but a set of rooms above a botanical supply merchant whose ground floor smelled of dried herbs and pressed specimens and which felt, of all the options available, most like something she could breathe in. She spent the first 2 days in practical preparation. The legal documentation of her standing restoration had been completed and entered into the official registry with the full public acknowledgement Evander had promised, a document she had read 4 times. Not because she distrusted its contents, but because she needed to feel the reality of her own name in the official record, needed to absorb the specific, quiet fact of existing formally in the kingdom's framework again after the ceremony had removed her from it. She was no longer an unregistered exile. She was Lena Voss, fully recognized, with the formal acknowledgement that the cascade classification had resulted from a non-acknowledgement at the designation ceremony that the restoration record named directly and without circumlocution. The hearing was on the 3rd morning. On the 2nd evening, she could not sleep. She lay in the room above the botanical merchant and listened to the night sounds of the capital, different from the dead villages, different from the grove, the specific layered noise of a city that never fully silences, and felt the particular, restless alertness of someone whose body understands that tomorrow requires something it has not yet been asked to give. She dressed at midnight, took her coat, walked out into the empty civic quarter. The council building stood at the quarter's center, large, formal, constructed 2 centuries ago in the architectural language of institutional authority. She had walked past it many times during her years at the archive without attending closely to it. She attended closely now, standing at its base in the midnight quiet, looking at the stone walls and the formal entrance and the courtyard surrounding it. She placed both palms flat against the courtyard stone paving. She felt it immediately, what was underneath. Old soil, deeply buried beneath 2 centuries of stone and civic construction, carrying in its deepest biological archive the specific seed memory of the communal grove that had stood on this land for 400 years before the building replaced it. She had read about this grove in the archive's historical records, one of the oldest documented communal spaces in the kingdom's capital, a gathering place for the original settlement's community, cleared when the council building's construction was approved by an administration that had decided the land's ceremonial use was less valuable than its institutional use. 2 centuries of soil memory, patient beneath the stone. She sat down on the courtyard's paving with her palms flat on the ground and let herself feel what tomorrow required of her. Not the legal strategy, not the demonstration, not the formal proceedings and their procedural framework. What it required underneath all of that, the specific, genuine emotion of standing in a formal room and saying clearly, I am here. This is real. The kingdom's land is alive in a way that your economic framework has not accounted for. And the reason it is alive is that I felt things you told me I should not feel. In places you told me had no future, and the feeling grew into forests. She let the feeling come fully. Not grief this time. Something more complex. Love, she thought, was the closest word, though it did not fully cover it. Love for the dead villages and the people in them. Love for the soil's patience across centuries of damage. Love for the mycorrhizal network connecting every grove she had grown into a single vast, living system that stretched across the kingdom's southern districts. Love, even for the specific, complicated situation of being in this courtyard at midnight about to ask a formal council to understand something that required them to feel rather than assess. She slept without noticing the transition, the way she always slept when her gift was working. The council members arrived for the hearing at dawn. They arrived to find the courtyard full of trees, ancient, towering, pressing close to every wall of the council building, their roots lifting the paving stones with the gentle, irresistible authority of things that have been waiting 200 years for permission to return. The building stood inside a grove. The formal entrance was framed by two enormous trunks whose canopies met overhead. The courtyard stone was already being reclaimed. Moss and fern, and the specific rich undergrowth of a 400-year forest emerging through every crack. Lord Aldrich stood at the grove's entrance in his formal council colors and looked at the building he had been meeting in for 11 years, standing inside an ancient forest. Then he looked for Lena. She was sitting at the grove's center, her palms on the roots of the largest tree, her eyes open, watching the morning light come through the canopy. She was not afraid. She had been sitting with her palms on the roots for 2 hours when it changed. Not the trees, not the grove, something in the quality of the communication between her hands and the ground beneath them, a shift in register. The way a conversation changes when both parties stop performing and begin actually speaking. She had been receiving the grove's response in the way she always received it. The specific warmth of recognized contact, the deep, slow pulse of root systems at work. The chemical language of soil biology translated through her palms into the interior, knowing that had been her gift's native mode since she was 14. Then the mycorrhizal network spoke. She had known the network existed, had understood it theoretically from years of botanical recording, as the fungal web connecting forest root systems into a single communicating organism. The ancient infrastructure through which forests shared resources and information across distances that individual trees could not bridge alone. She had known, in the 2 weeks of growing forests, that the groves she created were connected, had felt the faint thread of that connection when she pressed her palms to the roots of each new grove. The sense of something larger than the individual forest present in the contact. She had not understood, until this morning, that the connection ran in both directions. The network was not just connected, it was communicating, and it had been waiting, with the patient precision of something that operates on geological timescales, for her to be still enough and open enough and honest enough about what she was to receive, what it had been trying to tell her. It did not speak in language. It spoke in the way that very old, very complex biological systems speak, in chemistry, in electrical signal, in the specific frequency of information, moving through living tissue with the fidelity of something that has been refining its communication system for longer than human civilization has existed. But her gift translated it, the way it translated everything, into the interior knowing that she could receive. The translation was this: she was not the source. She had always thought of herself as the cause of the forests, the person whose tears triggered the growth, whose grief or joy or love provided the signal that woke the land's seed memory. This was accurate as far as it went, but it did not go far enough. What the network was telling her, in its precise biological language, was that the signal she provided was not a command. It was a recognition. She recognized the land's grief, and the land recognized hers. And in that mutual recognition something became possible that was not possible in the absence of it. The forests did not grow because she caused them. They grew because she and the land were, in those moments of genuine feeling, speaking the same language, and the speaking was what made the growth possible. She was not the forest's origin, she was the forest's interlocutor. The distinction moved through her with the specific, physical weight of a truth that reorganizes the architecture around it. She had spent 25 years understanding her gift as something she produced, a capacity she possessed, a phenomenon she caused, a power she carried and managed and hid. She understood now that this framing had been as limiting as the arithmetic method. She did not produce the forests. She was in conversation with the land, and the land, finally heard, responded with everything it had been holding. This was teachable. Not the tears, those required genuine feeling. And genuine feeling required the permission she had spent 2 weeks learning to give herself. But the conversation, the recognition, the specific willingness to feel what the land felt and let it be real. These were practices. These were capacities that could be cultivated in anyone willing to stop performing composure in the presence of damaged earth. The network was still speaking. She received it fully. Without the protective management that would have muted its signal, every grove she had grown present simultaneously in the vast, living web of connection. The southern district forests linked root to root to root in the single, breathing organism of the restored ecosystem, stretching across the kingdom's damaged landscape in a system of repair that was, she understood now, just beginning. She opened her eyes. Evander was standing at the grove's edge, in the morning light that came through the canopy in the specific diffuse luminescence of an ancient forest. And he had been there long enough that the grove had acknowledged his presence, a small, new growth of fern emerging from the root system beside his feet. The land responding to his stillness with the specific, quiet welcome it extended to things that were not a threat. He was looking at her with the most unguarded expression she had seen from him. She lowered her hands from the roots, stood. The grove breathed around her in its full, ancient, connected aliveness. She looked at him across the grove's center and said, "I know what it is now. All of it." The council chamber had roots in its floor. This was not metaphorical. The ancient trees pressing against the council building's exterior walls had extended their root systems through the foundation's original mortar joints. The specific, patient infiltration that old-growth root systems perform against stone over decades, compressed here into a single night, and the chamber's stone floor showed visible lines of displacement where roots ran beneath it, lifting certain sections by half an inch, cracking others along the mortar lines, pushing through in 2 places near the chamber's eastern wall where the new growth had found the path of least resistance and taken it. The council members had arranged themselves at the formal table with the specific, deliberate composure of people maintaining institutional dignity in a room that was being gently, irresistibly reclaimed by the forest surrounding it. Lord Aldrich sat at the table's center with the contained expression of a man who had entered a carefully prepared proceeding and found the preparation operating in an environment it had not accounted for. Lord Marsh was beside him, his expression the controlled neutrality of someone managing a significant recalibration. Councillor Vale had the particular stillness of a man who has been doing careful counting and has not yet finished. Dorset, the natural historian, sat at the table's end with the expression of someone in his professional element, which was the only expression in the room that contained anything resembling genuine interest in what was happening rather than management of its implications. Lena stood on the chamber floor. She had dressed for precision, not for impression, not for the performed authority of formal occasion, but for the specific clarity of someone who wants to be seen exactly as they are. Her botanical recording bag was at her feet. The notebook she had carried through the dead villages was in her hand. She was not performing composure. She simply was composed, in the way of someone who has spent 2 nights in ancient groves and has arrived at this room from somewhere more real than it. Evander sat in the gallery. He had not taken the formal seat at the council table that his position technically authorized. He had come as a witness, and a witness sat in the gallery and received what was offered rather than directing what was said. Aldrich opened for the precautionary assessment motion with the smooth efficiency of someone who had prepared extensively and was executing the preparation in the specific, confident register of a man who believes the room belongs to him. The uncontrolled biological phenomenon. The unknown mechanism. The economic disruption to established land valuations. The safety concern presented by unverified growth activity of unpredictable scale. He was thorough, credentialed by Dorset's institutional authority, and entirely focused on the procedural framework, which was, she recognized, precisely the correct strategy for a man who did not want to stand in the room's full reality and discuss what was actually happening. When he finished, the chamber's presiding officer looked at Lena. She did not address Aldrich's framework. She looked at the council and asked a single question. What was this land before this building was placed on it? The presiding officer looked at the documentation staff. A brief consultation. The archivist present confirmed, a communal grove, maintained for 400 years. Cleared for the council building's construction 2 centuries ago. The record was clear. She gestured at the roots pushing through the chamber floor. At the canopy visible through the high windows, the ancient trees pressing close to every wall. The land remembered what it was, she said. I provided what the land needed to remember. Not a mechanism. Not a phenomenon. A conversation. The land has been speaking since before this building was constructed, and before the system that built. It decided what land was for. I heard it, and I responded, and this is what the response looks like. She opened her botanical notebook to the page she had prepared. Species identification. Soil chemistry observations. Mycorrhizal network documentation from the morning's communication. She placed it on the table in front of Dorset, whose expression shifted from professional composure to genuine scientific interest in a way that was not fully under his management. Then she looked at the council. I would like to ask whether any council member has family history connected to the ancestral grove. Before you vote on whether what I do is a hazard. 2 council members, both older, both seated at the table's far end with the specific expression of people who had been managing their reactions since they walked through the grove to reach the building's entrance, looked at her with the full, honest attention she had been asking for since she was 8 years old, and a teacher had told her that honest attention was not for people like her. Lord Aldrich raised his hand for the vote before she had finished speaking. His voice carried the specific, clipped urgency of someone trying to close a door before the room can feel the weather outside it. The motion to classify the unidentified phenomenon as a precautionary hazard. All in favor. His hand was the only hand in the room. Marsh had not raised his. Vale had not raised his. Dorset was looking at the botanical notebook. The 2 council members with family history connected to the ancestral grove were looking at the roots in the floor. The room was very still. Aldrich's hand came down. The presiding officer looked at Lena with the expression of someone who has just watched a room change its mind and is now waiting to understand what it is changing its mind toward. The presiding officer gave her the floor. She had not prepared a speech. She had decided this deliberately. In the pre-dawn hours of the previous morning, while sitting in the new grove with her palms on the roots and the mycorrhizal network speaking its patient, vast truth into her hands, that the most powerful thing available to her in this room was not an argument. It was the same thing that had always been the most powerful thing available to her. The thing she had spent 25 years suppressing with the arithmetic method and the management and the careful emotional economy of someone who had been told repeatedly and convincingly that her power was a flaw. She was going to speak honestly, in a formal room, without management. She began with the dead villages. She told the council about Thresh, not as a case study, not as an economic data point, but as a place where a woman named Dara had come out of her house on a morning to find ancient trees in her dead front yard and had looked at them with the expression of someone whose capacity for hope had just been unexpectedly exceeded. She told them about the nameless village, the fallen sign, the 12 remaining residents, the specific, resigned dignity of people who have accepted that abundance is not available to them. She told them about Kala, and the child who had pressed a woven bracelet into her hand without explanation and run away. And she pulled back her sleeve and showed them the bracelet still on her wrist. She told them what the dead villages felt like from the inside of her gift. The specific quality of their soil, the exhaustion, the compaction, the seed memory waiting beneath it with the patient endurance of biological systems that measure time in centuries rather than fiscal years. She told them what it felt like to weep for land that was genuinely worth weeping for, and to wake in the morning inside the response. She told them about Instructor Casel. She had not planned to tell them about Instructor Casel. The memory arrived in the way that true things arrive when you have stopped managing your interior, not chosen, simply present, and once present too relevant to leave out. She told them about a classroom in the Omega Residential Quarters educational facility and a spring morning and a teacher's voice carrying across the full room to inform an 8-year-old child that her emotional display was a sign of weakness and would not be tolerated in formal settings. I spent 17 years believing that, she said. Not entirely, there was always a part of me that knew because the soil knew. Because every dead field I walked past responded to what I was carrying, and I could feel the response, even when I suppressed the feeling that would have answered it. But I believed it enough. Enough to count backward from 200 by 7s in every meeting, in every formal setting, in every room where feeling something real might have made me visible in a way that was dangerous. She looked at the council. The land needed me to feel things I had been told were a flaw. Every dead valley I walked through needed someone to grieve it genuinely, not to assess it clinically, not to calculate its remediation cost and its projected recovery timeline, but to sit on its pale ground and allow themselves to feel the loss of what it had been. The grief is not separate from the work. The grief is the work, and I was nearly too broken by the time I understood this to do it at all. She stopped. Let the sentence sit in the chamber with the roots in its floor and the ancient canopy visible through its windows. I am asking this council to recognize something that your existing framework does not have a category for, she said. Not a hazard, not a phenomenon, not an uncontrolled biological event. A practice, a form of tending, the specific, essential work of being genuinely present to what the land is feeling, which the land's biological systems respond to with everything they have. I am asking you to protect it, not because I need the protection for myself, but because the next person who walks through a dead valley and feels what the land feels needs to know that the feeling is not a flaw, that it is a capacity, that it is, in the most literal sense available to those words, what the world needs from them. She had been holding the feeling back since she began speaking, not from habit, not from strategy, but from the specific discipline of someone who wanted to finish the sentence before the tears arrived. She had finished the sentence. She stopped holding it back. She wept, in the council chamber, in a formal public space. For the first time since she was 8 years old, and a teacher had told her she could not. She wept for the dead villages and the restored groves and the 5 generations of the burned ancestral grove and the seed memory that had been waiting in the council building's foundation soil for 200 years. She wept for the specific, accumulated cost of 25 years of arithmetic. She wept for the bracelet on her wrist and the child who had given it and the 13 forests, growing in the kingdom's southern districts and the people standing in them. She did not close her eyes. She stood in the council chamber and wept with the full, unmanaged honesty of someone who has finally understood that there is no room that is too formal for this. The roots of the trees surrounding the building pushed visibly through the chamber floor, lifting the stones another half-inch with the slow, irresistible authority of living things continuing to grow. 3 saplings emerged from the cracks in the stone near the chamber's eastern wall. Small, perfect, already reaching toward the light. Lord Aldrich was looking at them. Councillor Vale was looking at Lena. The presiding officer's pen had not moved for 4 minutes. And at the far end of the table, the council member whose family had maintained the ancestral grove for 5 generations before the burning, whose grandfather had described the grove to him in the specific, aching detail of someone narrating a loss they had not stopped grieving, put his face in his hands. Not in distress. In the specific, overwhelmed release of someone whose grief has been witnessed for the first time. The chamber was very still. The stillness had a specific quality, not the stillness of a room waiting for a proceeding to continue. Not the managed quiet of institutional patience, but the specific, full stillness of a space that has received something and is in the process of understanding what to do with having received it. The roots in the floor were still growing, imperceptibly but measurably, the stone above them shifting in the slow, certain way of things that have made a decision and are executing it without urgency. The 3 saplings near the eastern wall had found the light from the high windows and were already orienting toward it with the focused, uncomplicated purpose of growing things. Evander rose from the gallery. He did not announce himself. He did not need to. The room's attention moved to him with the immediate, collective recognition of people who have been in a charged space for several hours and are now encountering the arrival of something that changes the charge's direction. He came down from the gallery to the chamber floor with the specific, deliberate unhurriedness of a man who has decided what he is going to do and is not performing the decision, but simply executing it. He did not go to the council table. He walked to the chamber floor and stood beside Lena. And the positioning was unambiguous, not in front of her, not behind her, not at a distance that preserved the interpretive space of official neutrality. Beside, at the same level, oriented in the same direction, presenting to the council as two people occupying the same ground. He addressed the council, not from the king's formal position at the table's head, not in the official register of royal proclamation. He spoke the way she had spoken, without management, without the performance of authority, in the plain voice of a man who has something to say and has decided that the saying is more important than the presentation. The ancestral grove, he said, has been a national wound for 5 generations. Every king since the burning has attempted to address it through the correct channels: botanical intervention, soil engineering, formal restoration programs administered by credentialed practitioners. Every attempt has failed, not because the practitioners were incompetent, because the approach was wrong. He looked at the council. The land did not need to be worked. It needed to be grieved. It needed someone to sit in its center and feel the loss of what it had been as genuinely as the people who had stood in it when it was alive. We did not know how to do this. We had been taught, as Lena was taught, as I expect most of the people in this room were taught, that the correct response to loss is management rather than grief. He paused. Let this sit in the room with everything else that was sitting in it. I turned away from a bond one recognized at the designation ceremony because I had decided in advance what my bond should look like. That decision sent Lena into exile on the road through the kingdom's most damaged landscapes. In exile, without the management that the kingdom's social framework had required of her, she wept freely for the first time in her adult life. The land responded to what she gave it. The 13 forests growing in the southern districts are the direct consequence of my decision to turn away, not as punishment, not as irony, but as the specific, literal result of what happens when a person who has been told their entire life that their feelings are a flaw is finally given the freedom to feel without walls. He turned to look at the precautionary assessment motion documentation that Aldrich had prepared, the thick, credentialed, carefully constructed argument for classifying Lena as an uncontrolled hazard, and then looked at Lord Aldrich directly. Lord Aldrich. His voice was level, carrying the specific quality of controlled precision that was his version of intensity. The dead zone land acquisitions in the Southern District will be reviewed under the original valuation framework. The land reclassification triggered by the Grove restorations will proceed through the standard assessment process with the full cooperation of the palace's legal office. The economic implications of that reclassification are the economic implications of the land becoming viable again, which is not a harm to be remediated, but an outcome to be welcomed. Aldrich's expression was the composure of a man at the end of a calculation who is beginning the next one. Evander placed a document on the table in front of the presiding officer. She had seen it before. She had read it, in fact, in the rooms above the botanical merchant. In the form of the draft she had been sent for review 2 days ago. The Living Land Charter. She had returned it with 3 specific amendments, all of which had been incorporated. The Living Land Charter, he said, establishes the formal legal recognition of ecological tending as a protected practice within the kingdom's land management framework. It creates the position of ecological keeper with full legal standing and specific authorities over land restoration assessment. It requires that land classified as dead zone receive formal grief assessment alongside technical remediation planning. The specific acknowledgement that damaged land requires genuine emotional engagement as part of its restoration process. Not as a supplement to technical intervention, but as an equal component of it. He looked at the council. The vote. The presiding officer called it. 11 council members. 9 in favor. 2 abstentions, recorded for the permanent documentation without comment on their source. Aldrich did not vote against it. He sat with the expression of a man who had completed his calculation and found the result inconvenient, but not surprising, and who had decided that the correct management of an inconvenient result was to begin the next calculation. The charter was entered into the kingdom's formal legal record with the date and the hour and the names of every council member present. The chamber was still. The roots were still growing. The 3 saplings near the eastern wall had reached 6 inches in the time the session had been running, and were not stopping. Evander stepped back from the table, turned to Lena. The gallery above them was beginning to empty as observers moved toward the exits with the specific energy of people who have witnessed something significant and are carrying it toward the outside world. He looked at her with the open, unguarded expression she had accumulated full vocabulary for across weeks of groves and dead villages and midnight conversations, and the specific, honest quality of his attention when he had decided to stop managing it. "The charter names you as ecological keeper," he said. "If you accept it." She looked at him for a long moment, at the traveling coat and the ink-stained hand and the man who had stood beside her on the chamber floor, and said the full true thing rather than the careful partial thing. "I wrote the position's authorities myself," she said. "I accept the position I designed." The corner of his mouth moved. "I noticed the amendments. They were necessary. They were correct." Outside the council building, in the grove that had grown from her love for the kingdom she had been walking through for 2 weeks, the trees were doing what ancient trees do when left to their own authority, growing patiently and without urgency in the specific, irresistible way of things that have finally been given permission to be what they always were. 6 years later, the kingdom's southern districts were unrecognizable. This was not hyperbole. It was the specific, documented assessment of the kingdom's official natural history survey, conducted annually since the Living Land Charter's passage, which tracked the restoration of the southern districts with the methodical precision of an institution that had learned, under the ecological keeper's influence, to document what was actually happening rather than what it had predicted would happen. The forests were larger than any model had projected. The mycorrhizal network connecting them had developed a density and complexity that the natural history office's most experienced practitioners described in their official reports with the specific, slightly dazzled language of scientists encountering something their frameworks were not yet large enough to contain. The dead zone designations had been formally dissolved in the 3rd year. All 41 parcels. Aldrich had completed his recalculation and had emerged from it as a man who had decided that the correct response to a fundamentally changed landscape was to change his investment orientation rather than his position. He had sold the dead zone parcels at their reclassified valuations, which was a significant financial correction, managed with the professional dignity of someone who understood that dignity was the most valuable remaining asset in a situation that had gone against him, and had redirected his interests toward the living land economy that the charter had created. He was not, in the revised landscape, a villain. He was an early adapter. He had made sure of this with the same methodical attention he brought to all significant investments. Marsh's imported timber monopoly had not survived the return of indigenous ancient forest to the southern districts, which produced timber of a quality and quantity that the import market could not compete with on any metric that mattered. Marsh had contested this for 2 years through the legal mechanisms available to him, had found the mechanisms insufficient, and had eventually departed the kingdom for a territory where the land had not yet learned to remember itself. This was documented in the Natural History Survey's 4th annual report under the category of economic externalities, with the specific neutrality of a document that did not editorialize but whose neutrality was, for anyone reading carefully, its own form of comment. The Living Land Council met in a chamber whose walls were living wood. Lena had grown them herself in a single night 3 years after the charter's passage, the most controlled expression of her gift she had ever attempted, guided by the mycorrhizal network's specific, patient instruction, and by 3 years of deepening conversation with the land's biological systems. The walls were oak, grown into architectural form with the specific precision of something that knew what it was being asked to become and had consented to become it. The chamber was warm in winter and cool in summer and smelled, always, of the specific living smell of old wood and deep root, and the clean, complex chemistry of ancient forest. The Living Land Council included representation from the communities who lived in the land, the village councils of Thresh and Calla, and 11 other restored communities, each sending a delegate to the monthly session. Each delegate with full voting rights equal to those of the palace's formal representatives. The equal weight of these votes had been the most contested element of the charter's original drafting, and the element Lena had been least willing to negotiate. She had not negotiated it. Evander sat at the council table as one voice among many, which was a positioning he had accepted without theater and which had made him, in the years since, more effective at the actual work of governance than the positioning of supreme authority had ever permitted. He had been observed, on at least 4 occasions by different witnesses who had mentioned it in the council's informal documentary record, asking the Thresh delegate questions and taking notes. Lena was not the queen. She held this position with the specific, settled clarity of someone who had designed her own role and was not interested in exchanging it for a different one. She was the ecological keeper, with the authorities she had written herself, which included the formal power to halt any land use decision that the mycorrhizal network's assessment identified as damaging, which was an authority that had been used 6 times in 3 years and had not been successfully challenged once. Their twins were 4 years old, a girl and a boy, both of whom wept freely and without self-consciousness when they were moved to weep, at sunsets, at the death of small animals, at the specific quality of morning light in the ancient grove that had grown from Lena's first exile night and that they had visited every month of their lives. Lena had never told them not to cry. Evander had never told them not to cry. They did not know, yet, that this was remarkable. The girl had shown nothing yet that could be called a gift in the specific sense. The boy had, twice, fallen asleep in the old grove with his hands on the roots, and the undergrowth nearest to him had been notably richer the following morning. Lena had documented this in her botanical notebook with the same careful precision she brought to everything, and had told no one except Evander, who had read the entry and looked at his son with the expression of a man updating a very important assessment. On a morning in early spring, both children were in the ancestral grove, their usual Tuesday morning, while the council met and their parents worked, supervised by the grove's keeper, a young woman from Thresh who had been the first graduate of the ecological tending program Lena had established in the charter's 2nd year. The boy had his hands on the roots of the largest tree. The girl was sitting with her face turned up toward the canopy, watching the light. The grove keeper found Lena in the council chamber afterward and said, with the specific, wondering restraint of someone reporting something they wanted to be precise about, "The girl did not touch anything. She simply looked at the dead section near the grove's northern edge, the one that is not fully restored, and it started growing." Lena set down her pen, looked at the grove keeper with the full, clear attention of someone receiving significant information. "How much?" she asked. 6 inches of new growth. In the time it took me to walk to the other side of the grove and come back." Lena picked up her botanical notebook, opened it to a new page, wrote the date, the time, the location, the observation. Then she stood and went to find her daughter, because there were things the girl needed to know, not to be afraid of, not to hide, not to manage with any method that reduced what she was to something a formal room could comfortably contain. Things the girl needed to know were possible. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.